Episode 18. Attention and the Centers. Another spiritual conversation with the Keeper of the Knowledge took place in a picturesque mountain gorge. In the distance, the iridescent murmur of a low cascading waterfall could be heard. The first rays of the sun touched the treetops, high above the students' heads, high on a steep mountain slope. The moist, slightly sloping glade below was overgrown with thick, sweet grasses. The morning dew was cold on the students' bare feet. Freshness penetrated into their lungs, filling the bodies with vigor and helping to concentrate on the upcoming lesson. All the people gathered around the teacher wanted to breathe deeply, feeling harmony and unity with nature, with the whole universe, with God. The upcoming conversation with the sage was devoted to attention and concentration. The first question came from a short, fit woman in her 30s or 40s, with golden hair gathered in a neat, long ponytail. Her bright blue eyes shone with insight and deep inner confidence. "Teacher," she turned to the sage, "during meditation on a point, I can't feel emptiness. I feel only calmness in my body, emotional peace. Is it possible to regard this as a result of calming the mind, or is it because my sleep has intensified so much?" "A good question, Irina." The keeper looked warmly at the student and began to explain. If we sit in the right position, we start breathing differently, and the body relaxes. But the most important thing is attention. It is necessary to feel it and observe it. It should be directed at the point, and at the same time, at the sensations of the body. It must be understood that attention will constantly be distracted, and it was just then that a thought flashed by, and it began to drift to something else, to move away from the point following this thought. Some emotion has arisen, and attention is already following it. "Yes, I know it very well," the student said, recognizing her own feelings in the keeper's description. "But what is the best way to resist this?" "The best way is to observe your attention," the sage readily explained. "Feel it, and track where it goes and what it is redirected to. Try to observe the body and the point at the same time. Then we will begin to understand a lot. Emptiness is difficult at first, because emptiness is where attention comes from. Therefore, first you need to learn to feel the attention itself, to understand what it is. And the next step is to see where it comes from. And only then can we feel emptiness. But if we do not feel the attention itself, then how will we feel emptiness?" The sage looked at Irina shrewdly, but his question was addressed not only to her, but also to the rest of the students, who were sitting around and catching every word of the conversation. He encouraged everyone to reflect, to pass the knowledge gained through themselves, to imagine how this could happen during practice, in order to remember and subsequently implement the practice, and to experience it spiritually. "I understand," said Irina, and at that moment her face lit up with the inner light of awareness. "We ourselves think of feeling emptiness, right? But we must not think of it, but first feel the attention that is there, right?" "Well done." The keeper of the knowledge praised the student. "You understand correctly. First, we must direct our attention to the point, then to the body, and then to extraneous thoughts and emotions that will inevitably arise. There is one very good practice. It is simple, but it helps very well to learn how to manage attention. The essence of it is to focus on your body and start managing attention in a circle. Teacher, please tell us more, Arena asked. At the end of today's conversation, we will do this practice, the sage replied with a mysterious smile. But now I will tell you what you have to do. You will need to focus on the sensations of your own body, concentrating first upon the crown, feeling your attention there, and gradually transferring it from one part of the body to another in a circle. The crown, right ear, right shoulder, right hand, right hip, right knee, right foot, left knee, left hip, and so on, until the circle closes and we are back on the crown of our head. Then we switch back to the right ear and go around the circle over and over again. So attention should kind of move along the contour of our body, the woman clarified. Yes, the keeper confirmed. Attention goes around the periphery, and when you do this practice, you need not just say, attention moves to the right hand. It is necessary to feel this change. It must be accompanied by effort. And we have to keep track of our feelings, and if our attention is shifted, we must immediately understand what exactly it is shifted to. This is how we realize where attention goes, and only after that will we learn to feel it and understand its source. We have to observe where it comes from and who exactly directs it, and that is when we come to emptiness. Beloved teacher, Arena asked again after a little thought, can we say that attention is a pure mind without thoughts? No. The sage shook his head negatively and began to explain. It is not the mind. Attention can be directed to the mind, or it can be directed to the body. We can also see our own thoughts if our attention is not directed to them. But attention is not thoughts either. The teacher paused, choosing a suitable image for comparison. Look, our consciousness is the light of a light bulb, and attention is a special lens for focusing. It gives the light a direction, highlights what the light is directed to, be it inside or outside of us. And we can control this focus, directing it to one thing to another. We can expand or narrow this ray of light. We can narrow it down to the perception of only one point. Another student came forward, a bright young brunette in a beige linen pantsuit. Teacher, may I try to give an example of how I understand it? She asked, and after waiting for the sage's approving nod, continued. Let's say a child fell over and scratched his knee. He is hurt. He is in pain. All his attention is focused on this knee, on this pain. And to shift this ray of consciousness, his mom says to him, "Look, a bird is flying," and points with her hand somewhere in the sky. While his attention was focused on his knee, he was crying. Yet the next moment, the beam of his consciousness refocused, and his attention was transferred to another place. He began to think about the bird, and forgot about the knee, and even stopped feeling pain. A very good example, Rita, the keeper praised the student and explained. In fact, it also shows that the body is not us, and all our thoughts are not us, because if we do not pay attention to some thought, it does not exist for us. So it is the same with the body, right? A very young guy with a shock of curly hair and expressive brown eyes asked with surprise. That is, If we divert attention, for example, from pain, will we stop feeling it? Yes, Eric, that is right, the sage confirmed. If we do not direct our attention to the body, it also does not exist for us. Then it turns out that we are paying attention, the guy clarified. You got it right. The keeper smiled. We are the light of consciousness that focuses on different things with the help of the lens of attention. Attention directs this light to different things that we see. And what is beyond our attention does not exist for us. That is, until we feel our body, it will not exist for us. If we reject some thoughts, do not direct attention towards them, they will also disappear. If we do not hold emotions with our attention, they will also be gone. The sage looked around the students, trying to determine from their faces how much they had understood, how much they had passed through this knowledge. It turns out that attention always works, right? Asked the thin girl with sharp shoulders and pretty freckles scattered on her cheeks. But our task is to guide and control it? The first thing we have to learn to do is to see attention, the keeper explained, because a person sees only what he highlights. In our example, the child saw the scratched knee first, then the bird, but he did not realize that he was attention. Attention was directed to the knee, which hurt, then to the bird, and then he forgot about the knee. We need to understand that we are attention, and everything else is not us. That is, we identify with what our attention is directed to, Eric asked. For example, we direct our attention to some clothes and identify with them, and the next moment we direct our attention to something else, and now we identify with this thing. That is right, the sage replied. Therefore, we must see this attention, feel it, feel how it moves, how it focuses on something, then switches to something else. Watch your attention. When we understand what our attention is, then we will go to its source. Eric looked gratefully at the teacher, making it clear that he had realized this wisdom. And meanwhile, another student raised his hand. It was a well-built man with bizarre tattoos covering his arms up to his shoulders. Teacher, I want to ask you something, he began. Our world is arranged so that a person is constantly sleeping because our attention wanders all the time, jumping from one thing to another. It is absolutely uncontrollable and scattered. We can't even concentrate or feel that we ourselves are attention. Please explain. Did God arrange this on purpose to confuse us? Yes, Vlad, the sage confirmed after listening to the question. If we were born enlightened right away, life would not be the way it is. We would not be able to develop or come to realizations. Therefore, God made it so that we do not remember past incarnations. Otherwise, we would know a lot of things, and life would be different. God made it so that we are in a sleeping state. If we were born enlightened, we would sit in the lotus position, and there would be no life as such. To get important experience, we must be born in darkness, in a sleeping state, identified with everything we see. Then, life will be as it is, a diverse, rich game of God. Teacher, isn't it possible that we, having understood all this, violate the rules of the game? Vlad asked thoughtfully. If we no longer want to identify with what the attention is directed to, if we understand that we are our attention and not something else? The sage looked at Vlad with calm confidence. "Only some people discover the secret," he said. "A very small number of people. And then they have a chance to be enlightened, to get rid of this whole game. But most people have to be immersed in the game. Otherwise, there will be no life. We will not get the experience and impressions that we should receive on earth. If we remembered what happened in our past life and how we lived in the subtle world between incarnations, then our life here would be different." At this moment, a girl of about 25 with dark brown hair, an open high forehead, and a friendly look of small attentive eyes raised her hand. "Beloved teacher, I have a question about the nature of attention," she began, in a smooth, melodious voice. "Attention doesn't just wander, does it? It doesn't go to everything in sight. Maybe there are some magnetic points to which it is most often attracted? And if there are, how is it formed? Through upbringing?" "A very deep and important question, Lana," the keeper of the knowledge praised the student, and began to explain in detail. "Attention passes through our centers, motor, instinctive, emotional, and intellectual centers, and only after that does it go to something. And each of our centers operates in a special way. For example, the instinctive center constantly gives a person some desires and needs, in food, in water, in sleep. That is, attention passes through the instinctive center and is directed, for example, to the desire to eat. And while we direct our attention to this, we will want to eat. And if, for example, we switch to something else, then we forget about it. And since our attention is already identified with the instinctive center, we believe that these desires are ours. Is it the same with the emotional and intellectual centers?" the woman clarified. The sage nodded, confirming the student's guess, and continued to speak. "When our attention passes through the emotional center, then we further perceive the whole world through the prism of a specific emotion. For example, if we are happy, then everything around us will seem beautiful. Yet if we are angry, then even the slightest noise will annoy us, and so on. It is the same with the intellectual center, where thoughts constantly arise. A thought comes to us, and we are already assessing the situation from the point of view of this thought." "It turns out that the centers just determine our perception?" Lana asked again, to see if she understood the teacher's words correctly. "Yes, that is right," the keeper replied affirmatively. "And at the same time, we are initially identified with all this. That is, we think that emotions, thoughts, and instinctive desires are ourselves. Moreover, the instinctive center builds one line of behavior, the motor center builds another, the emotional center builds a third, and the intellectual center builds yet a fourth. And all of them attract our attention, so that it identifies with a specific center, and then it begins to see everything in the world through the prism of this center, to perceive it from a certain angle." "Teacher, is this inevitable?" Rita asked, pushing back her long hair. "Is attention manifested only through our centers? But then, how can we work with it?" "This is inevitable and normal for life," the sage explained with the intonation of a person who is privy to the innermost secret knowledge. "Attention is not aware of itself. We are completely asleep, completely identified. We do not even understand that our centers are working, but we need to observe and study this work. If a person could see how these processes occur in him, he would already be much freer. But a person does not see that when the process occurs, it already completely captures him. For example, if there is some kind of negative emotion, say resentment, it already completely owns the person, and he does not understand that this is just the work of the emotional center. And so he begins to get all worked up over and over again. Then the mental center is activated. Thoughts appear about how the offender did wrong to him and why. And all these processes twist a tangle of negativity, and it grows like a huge snowball. And if a person could see how he is arranged, then he would no longer be identified. He would not be in a sleeping state. The first thing that is important is to realize attention. The second is to start studying the work of your centers. Observe and monitor these processes in yourself, and then everything will become clear. And if a person has known himself, then he will no longer be identified and asleep. The topic that the teacher was discussing today was quite complicated, but the students who had gathered here in the mountain gorge with picturesque slopes had been walking on the spiritual path for several years. They listened, noticed something, actively reflected, and tried to figure it out as much as possible. Therefore, the flow of questions did not stop. Arena stepped forward again. Teacher, and when we try to make a gap, we are in fact identified with something. For example, when our attention is offended and we make a gap, then as it turns out, we pull our attention out of the offense? Yes, the sage confirmed. When we direct our attention to this, we begin to realize exactly what is happening to us. What kind of process is the gap? The student asked again. If I understood right, the spotlight itself, the light itself is our consciousness, and it dissipates, pours out, if there is no lens of attention. Attention is a magnifying glass that collects it and can direct, expand, and narrow it. And identification is when we believe that we are that grass blade or our clothes. The woman paused, choosing words and trying to express her understanding as accurately as possible. We identify with these. That is, we can say that this is the very end of the spotlight beam. We don't look at all these stages. We don't see the magnifying glass itself, the light source itself. We only see the final spot of light. Arena looked at the teacher, half interrogatively, to make sure whether she was thinking correctly or even in the right direction. His approving look gave her inspiration. That is, there at the end is identification, and where is the gap? She asked. And the gap is when we see the process itself, how everything happens, the sage replied. That there is a thing with which we are identified, that there is attention, that it passes through our centers, our emotional, intellectual, instinctive centers. We see this thing through their prism. If we see this whole mechanism, then disidentification occurs. Teacher, can you give an example? Arena asked. I kind of understand, but maybe not completely. How it should all happen? The sage nodded eagerly. Look here, he began to explain. For example, my attention is identified with this voice recorder. I believe that this is my voice recorder, and whether it records or not, I am identified. I have directed attention to it. Then my spiritual part turns on, and I start thinking. I start tracking what is happening. The spiritual part helps me to disidentify. This is its role. I think about what processes are going on in me, and I begin to understand that the intellectual center has the idea that it is my voice recorder. Then I have various worries about whether it is working or not. My attention is directed to these worries, and it is also directed to the idea that the recorder is mine. And I see the whole process, and if I already see it, then I cannot be as much identified with the recorder as before. But this is only the first stage of disidentification, right? Eric asked, carefully following the thread of the conversation. Yes, you can go further, said the sage. For example, if you then start thinking, and who am I? I am the consciousness that is placed in the biorobot, and this biorobot lives some kind of life of its own, and it has a voice recorder in this life. He wants to do something with it. What does it have to do with me? I am just living in it and watching all this fuss that is going on. A faint, transparent smile appeared on the keeper's face. He spoke in a measured, deliberate manner, and his voice affected the students in a special way. It helped them to concentrate, cleared their consciousness, and made it possible to reach the most distant aspects of the knowledge. If I see it that way, then I am even more detached, he continued. And then I realize that I am not a doer, but just a witness who lives in this doer. And then the gap increases even more. And the more such perceptions and experiences there are in us, the more disidentified we are. Do I understand correctly that our task is to master attention? The guy asked again, looking inquisitively into the eyes of the keeper of the knowledge. Yes. It turns out that attention begins to pay attention to itself. It is usually directed outwards through our centers, and then suddenly it turns inwards and begins to see itself. Attention directs the ray of consciousness to the centers, to the various roles through which it passes and goes to its source. Gradually, attention approaches the source and begins to see it all. It turns inwards, and that is where the whole process begins. Teacher, Arena asked, could you explain, please, by example? Okay, look here. In this example with a voice recorder, a person identifies himself with it. He directs his attention to this recorder and does not think that any thoughts make him identify, does not try to understand where they came from and why. He does not track his emotions. For example, he gets angry if someone tries to take his voice recorder without asking, gets upset if it breaks down, and rejoices if he manages to turn it on. But a person does not think where it all came from. He does not think that he highlights the recorder with his attention, and thereby activates all his emotions. And if he is suddenly told about something else, he shifts his attention. And that is it. Now, he has already forgotten about the recorder and has effectively been distracted. Then, after a few days, he will think, I probably need to see if the recorder is working, but maybe he will not remember at all. The keeper paused, looked at the students who were sitting in a semicircle in front of him on the bright green spring grass, and turned his gaze to the dawn sun, whose iridescent disk was already rising in the east, illuminating the mountain slopes overgrown with young vegetation. If attention turns inward, the sage continued, a person begins to see everything that is inside, the biorobot, centers, personalities, roles, their source, and so on. And that is where the awakening begins. The more we look inside ourselves, the faster we wake up. The students listened to the sage with concentration, and understanding could be seen on the faces of some of them. But there still were questions. This time, Vlad, a strong man with tattoos on his arms, raised his hand again. "I have a question," he began, taking a couple of steps toward the keeper. "How does this knowledge relate to the various types of different people? There is an intellectual type, emotional, and mechanical type, right? If I understand you correctly, the attention of each type of person mainly passes through their own center, which is given at birth?" "Vlad, you understand correctly." The sage looked approvingly at the disciple. "To a greater extent, through the type that is given at birth. An intellectual person thinks about which books he read, which writer said what. The emotional type evaluates everything through the prism of his emotions. For example, in the like-dislike categories. And a person with a predominant physical center thinks more about what to eat and what actions to do. But this does not mean that other centers do not work at all. They also work, but to a lesser extent. The predominant center draws attention to itself. Ideally, the fourth type of person should balance all the centers in himself so that they are combined harmoniously in him. For example, so that a person evaluates everything, with not only their emotions, not only with the help of intelligence, so that he can do something with his hands, and so that he can do things like to physically move, dance, do yoga, or wushu. The centers must be balanced. Only then can a person see everything more soberly and perceive things correctly. "Thank you for the explanations, great sage," Vlad said with sincere gratitude, retreating to the rest of the students. "Now I understand how it should be, what we need to strive for." The sage smiled, sending the man bright and pure energy, the power of support, love, and approval. "We perceive everything with the centers," he spoke again, giving the students the next portion of the knowledge, concretizing and trying to explain things that were difficult to perceive with simple examples. For example, if a person has a brain pathology, his intellectual center does not work, so he cannot fully perceive everything. A paralytic's physical center does not work, and he also perceives the world one-sidedly, because he is deprived of so many things. When we perceive the world with all centers evenly, only then can we get a holistic picture of life. If some center is skewed to one side, then the whole picture is distorted. An intellectual person then lives in abstract philosophizing. A person of the physical type only thinks whether he has eaten or not. He is more concerned about his instinctive desires. In any case, there is a skew, and there should be a uniform perception of these centers. Then the image will be correct. "Teacher, a comparison came to my mind," said a tall, thin guy with a short crew cut, dressed in a traditional long orange robe. "Sometimes the image consists of 3 colors. If only one color prevails, for example, red or yellow, the picture will be perceived incorrectly. And if all the 3 colors are evenly distributed, then the image will be clear, holistic, and harmonious." "A good comparison, Alex," said the keeper of the knowledge. "Indeed, that is true. If some center does not work, then the person can no longer act normally, which means that he cannot be whole and live in harmony. A paralytic cannot move his limbs because the motor center does not work. A mentally retarded person does not understand anything because the intellectual center does not work." Alex nodded and thoughtfully began to reason. "I have such a picture before my eyes. A spotlight of consciousness is located at the top, and it sends its powerful beam onto some object of observation. But there are 5 different colored pieces of glass between the object and the spotlight, which distort the perception in their own way. These glasses are our centers, sexual, motor, instinctive, emotional, and intellectual. And the scattered beam of the spotlight focuses with the help of the attention lens and passes through the glass, and then the beam gets tinged with the same color. Then there is a directed colored beam of light that hits the object of observation. That is, we already see this object through the prism, through one of these centers. "Very good, Alex," the sage praised his disciple with a beaming smile, rejoicing at his success in moving along the path of knowledge. "We have a similar poster in one of the temples, and it shows very clearly how it all happens." The student nodded, and it was clear that the approval of the keeper of the knowledge was very valuable and pleasant for him, but it was not a goal in and of itself. "Teacher, and when we direct this lens of attention to ourselves, it turns out that in fact it is necessary to overcome all this, to see before you get to your consciousness?" he asked after a moment's thought. "And you won't be able to get to it until you see all the parts and all the colored glass, right?" "Yes. You pay attention inside and immediately encounter all these pieces of glass. With your rolls, you begin to see it all. You cannot turn inside, and without seeing this level, immediately fly into Atman." Alex thought again, and smoothing his hair with his wide palm, began to speak again. "It turns out that you dismiss everything with which you can identify, and say, 'My emotions are not me, and my desires are not me. My thoughts are not me. My things and my clothes are not me.' And if you pause at something and say to yourself, 'And this is me,' will you never get to the truth?" "You must go deeper," the sage said calmly. "And if we do this, then we begin to see it all. If a scientist looks at a voice recorder and thinks about how it works, then we look at ourselves and understand how we are arranged. That is the main difference. When attention turns inward, we know ourselves, and in the end, we will know Atman." The teacher fell silent and looked at the students in anticipation of new questions, and they were not long in coming. This time a burly woman with long velvet eyelashes and a low, charming voice raised her hand. "Great sage, but different sharp corners, difficult situations in life, do I understand correctly that they can be considered as an opportunity to gain awareness and spiritual growth?" she asked, looking closely at the sage. "I think that if we are feeling some sharp corner, some kind of negative event, then the silliest thing is to think that someone else is to blame. Such a thought takes your attention to the outside world, but on the contrary, you need to look inside yourself and get the necessary awareness." "A very correct idea, Tasha. When everything is calm, then it is not clear with what we identify ourselves. Everything is quiet, comfortable it seems, and we do not identify with anything. And when there is a sharp corner, you can immediately see that this is what I am identified with. Here are the negative emotions. Here are the lies that justify them. Everything is immediately highlighted, and it becomes clear how the centers work, what personalities there are, what roles. It all starts to pop up. This is how we can know ourselves. And if we are in too calm a state, half asleep, it seems to us that there is nothing, and it is not clear what to learn then." After answering the student's question, the sage turned his gaze to Lana, who was again raising her hand. "Can we say that if the focus of attention is aimed at one little blade of grass, then there is no energy?" the girl asked. "But gradually, when you begin to expand your consciousness and attention, do you begin to care not about one single blade, but about the whole world? The expansion of consciousness is slightly different. The keeper shook his head. But it is not even about a blade of grass, but first of all, about attention. It is directed at our ego. Then it goes through its prism. We are taught to be selfish from childhood. But how does it happen, great sage? Lana asked with genuine surprise. Do parents want their children to become selfish? Of course, they do it unconsciously, but they are taught to concentrate on themselves. For example, a child thinks about some of his toys. He wants to walk, run, study the world around him, and his parents ask him, "What grade have you got, a 2 or a 5? They begin to evaluate the child in the bad, good categories. And that is how they begin to make him identify with himself. If he gets a 2, then he is bad. If he gets a 5, then he is good. And such an assessment is constantly coming from the entirety of society. What have you earned, or what have you done? What do you look like? What things do you own? And so on. And so a person begins to identify with this ego, and he begins to worry about this selfishness, and all his attention is focused on it. And how can we resist this? Eric, the guy with curly blonde hair, chimed in. It was clear that this question really concerned him, literally bugging him. We need to try to stop identifying with our egoism, the sage explained. If a person expands his attention, he no longer concentrates on how others evaluate him. And then he can be focused not on selfishness, but on helping people. And the more he tries to help people, the faster he stops being selfish. And why do you think? The teacher asked, addressing the question to all the students, simultaneously, the process of searching for the truth in their heads. Because his attention is no longer focused on the ego, Vlad replied with a half-questioning intonation. Well done, smiled the keeper of the knowledge. Where our attention is, energy begins to go there. This can even be seen on the physical level. For example, if we direct our attention to the arm, we will feel that more energy begins to go there, more blood begins to flow to this limb. And that is just because we have focused our attention on it. So the energy begins to go into egoism if we are focused on it. Therefore, if we have shifted our attention to the outside world, to good sublime states, then the ego begins to die, and sublime emotions begin to develop. So it's not the same when we talk about studying our attention and knowing its source, Vlad asked. Yes, it is slightly different, what we focus on. We focus on selfishness, or on helping others. And if we redirect our attention to helping, then the shell of the ego begins to collapse, and the assessment of others becomes no longer important to a person. It becomes important that you can do good to other people, how you can show sublime emotions. That is how a person begins to gradually expand consciousness and ceases to live in the shell of his ego and merges with the vast world. And then his attention begins to expand to the whole world. And while he is focused on selfishness, how can he think about people? He is inhibited and therefore cannot open up so that his attention expands and he feels part of something great, something whole, and part of God, part of all life. And only when he shifts the focus from the ego, which was formed in childhood, to the outside world, to helping, to sublime emotions, only then can he perceive himself as part of a vast and infinite world. Having finished speaking, the teacher looked at the students again. "And now," he said with a touch of mystery, "we are going to do the attention management practice that I told you about at the very beginning, remember?" The students nodded in agreement, and an excited buzz of voices was heard. The keeper of the knowledge waited until it subsided, and everyone prepared, tuning in to the upcoming practical exercise. When everyone was ready, he started talking. "Take a position so that you are comfortable," he said slowly in a deep, low voice, stretching the words a little, and his speech sounded especially peaceful. "Breathe deeply and calmly. Close your eyes and concentrate all your attention on the top of your head." The students closed their eyes and focused on their inner feelings. "Slowly transfer your attention to the right ear," the keeper said, in a measured, smooth voice. "Feel it. Observe your attention." He paused, during which nothing was heard except the sounds of nature. "And now shift your attention to the right shoulder, to the right hand, right hip, right knee, right foot, left knee, left hip, left hand, left shoulder." The students were settled around the keeper of the knowledge, extremely focused on the exercise. They listened to the sage's deep, vibrating voice, which filled the entire surrounding space. A light breeze playfully stroked the people's hair and touched their skin, bringing a pleasant coolness and a feeling of freshness. But the students no longer felt it, since it did not fall into their focus of attention, which meant it did not exist for them. They totally concentrated on different parts of the body, making an effort to shift their attention like a spotlight of consciousness. The teacher talked and talked, and the students were immersed in observation. It was evident from their faces that at the moment they were carrying out important internal work that would help them see and feel the source of attention itself. When the practice ended, the students began to open their eyes, returning to their senses. Some did it quickly, others took a little longer. But everyone wanted to share their impressions of the experience they had just experienced. Many people's faces shone with genuine delight, as if they had witnessed a miracle, something incredible, while others reacted in a more restrained way. But it was clear that they did not remain indifferent. "It was very difficult," Rita shared her feelings with everyone, "as my attention constantly flew off and went to extraneous thoughts. And I remembered about it only after a few moments, realizing that I was actually thinking about something else. I then had to concentrate again." "Yes, I also had it," Lana said with enthusiasm. "I had to make efforts to keep my attention on certain parts of the body, but then, on some of the circles, imagine, I felt as if attention was something material, as if some invisible energy was moving from one thing to another. It's an amazing feeling." All the students met this response with approval. "Oh, and I had a feeling that attention was a camera lens," Alex said emotionally, deciding to share his own revelations about what he had just experienced. "And I controlled it. Snap, and attention moved to one object, snap, and then I clearly saw another thing. Only instead of these objects, they were my own body parts. And so, I turned this lens in a circle." Listening to the trembling impressions of the students, the keeper of the knowledge looked at them with kindness and love, supporting and approving everyone. Despite the fact that the experience gained was different, the sage gave everyone rays of support. The students talked about their experiences for a long time, and the keeper of the knowledge gave them feedback, encouraged them, and answered any questions that arose, Everyone had a vivid spiritual experience, and it brought a new portion of realizations that were important for spiritual development. Just think of that. I managed to completely stop the internal dialogue, Irina spoke with delight, and her bright blue eyes began to sparkle because of the importance of the awareness received. It was clear that they were literally overflowing with energy. When I started concentrating on every part of my body, all thoughts were gone, and only sensations remained. Nothing else existed for me. Only my ear, hand, hip, knee. After listening to Irina's impressions, the keeper smiled. Yes, that is how it should be. He nodded approvingly. Remember, we are attention. Everything that is beyond our attention does not exist for us. Having said this, the keeper paused, giving the students the opportunity to share their experience with each other. But when I felt my hand, I suddenly realized that the rest of the body didn't exist, Eric said with genuine admiration. I heard that this is how it should be, but I did not fully believe that it was possible to feel it directly. There was really nothing else, just my hand. That's all. This is a very important experience, the sage confirmed. You need to repeat the practice, and then you will be able to feel it again and again, and attention management will become easier. Did anyone manage to separate themselves from thoughts and feel the presence of an observer, a witness, or Atman? Vlad came forward. Yes, great sage, I think I managed to feel it, he replied. I concentrated so much that it was as if I had separated from my body and looked at myself from the outside, at what I was doing, and I realized that it was Atman, the divine part of the soul, where attention comes from. I felt that it was the very source. In the man's voice there were notes of sincerity, pure joy and bright happiness, mixed with peace and something elusive, sublime, spiritual. A very good result, the teacher praised Vlad with a warm smile. Now the main thing is to do this practice every day, every single day. This will help to consolidate awareness, and we will learn to manage attention more easily. And if you all learn to manage attention, then you will learn to manage yourself. You will be able to achieve any goals, achieve absolutely any results, and everything will be fine with you. On this note, the teacher announced a 2-hour break for rest, after which the conversation about attention was to continue. We invite you to join spiritual seminars, workshops, and retreats hosted by the Leader Masters. Reveal your superpowers, find your predestination, and accumulate power to gain well-being and bring your goals to life. Send an email saying, "I want to join the seminar" to our mailbox, and we will give you all the information. See you soon.